Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into the badass women of Israel. Let's get started. As I know, many of my listeners have been watching the news about all of the ceasefire negotiations and the hostage releases and all of these incredible, tragic, amazing stories. I wanted to try to stay a little bit away from those topics this week, although I'll be honest, I did find a way to tie it in. But on this week's episode, I've been dying to do a special on the women of Israel, and especially the badass women of Israel. And this last week or two has really been a great excuse to do it because the last few weeks we've been hearing the testimony from some of the female survivors that have come out of Gaza, and it only proves the point. The women of Israel today are nothing short of badass. And you're going to see how this isn't a new phenomenon. This actually runs throughout our entire history. So on this episode, I want to talk about these badass women of the past and of the current time. And I do have to add that I'm going to make this podcast in honor of two people that I want to shout out. The first one is Shiri Bibas. Shiri Bibas, many of you probably know, is still in captivity. Her well-being is unknown. Her two sons that were with her, that she obviously was trying to take care of. We pray that she will be okay. And in her honor, I want to talk about these badass Israeli women. The other person that I want to dedicate this episode to was someone I learned about when I was in Israel. And if you haven't heard the episode that we talked about her, listen to the episodes I've Been on a Mission, where we talk about her story. And her name is Adi Vital Kaplun. If you listen to her story, you will know that she is the epitome of a badass Israeli woman. In her honor, we are going to talk on this episode about women just like her. When speaking to a follower on social media, I often find myself talking about the women of Israel, the women of the Bible, Judaism and how we look at women versus other faiths and religions and beliefs. And something that always stuck out to this follower is the way that the Jewish people respect women and really appreciate women in the sense of our women are some seriously badass women. And we don't shy away from applauding and appreciating and telling those stories. And this past week, when we hear the tragic stories coming out of Gaza from these hostages, we can see it's in their DNA. But first, let's start with the historical stories. We'll see the badass women of the past, and then we can see the badass women of today. Some of the stories out of the Hebrew Bible where we see these female characters are lesser known, unfortunately. And they should be wider known because they are very important stories. From the very beginning, our matriarchs in the Hebrew Bible or the Torah play important roles. They are often either behind the scenes, making things happen, directing their partners in certain ways, helping their sons, providing guidance, and really being the backbone of the Jewish nation. That's why, maybe unlike other faiths or backgrounds, we talk extremely highly about our matriarchs. Very often we use the term patriarchs and matriarchs, whereas many people don't really care about the matriarchs. Maybe they don't even name them. But we can see the importance of these people, that their stories were told. We may not focus on them so much, but they are there for a reason. Leaving aside the matriarchs, who all have incredible stories of their own, we move down to the time of the judges. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with biblical history, there was a time from when the Israelites got into the land of Israel before King Saul, the first king, was chosen by God and created the kingdom of Israel. This was a time of tribal areas, but there needed to be judges who would kind of decide between tribes or between people within tribes when something went wrong. If this tribe went over land that didn't belong to them, who do you go to find out what we should do? How do we solve this problem? When we talk about the time of the judges, most people know the name Samson, as in Samson and Delilah. He was listed in the judges. But what a lot of people don't know was that there was a judge named Deborah. In about the 14th century, before the Common Era, Deborah was a judge of the Israelite people. She would work with the different tribes. She would get prophecy from God about how to deal with some of these situations. And God trusted her to be a fair judge and to lead her people. This, I imagine at that time, would have been incredibly rare. Female leaders, even today, is somewhat rare. So back then, to have a female leader entrusted that people look to for help and for support, it's pretty forward and progressive if you ask me. During the time that Deborah was a judge, unfortunately, the Israelites who were living in the land were dealing with the Canaanites, who still lived around the area, would have constant conflict with the Israelites, and Deborah wanted to put an end to it. So Deborah, deciding to send out her best general to go and fight the Canaanites, sends out Barak. Barak, unfortunately, didn't succeed on the battlefield. He had died on the battlefield, but his men did do a lot of damage to the opposing Canaanite general and his army. That general's name was Sisera. Rather than die on the battlefield, he kind of cowardly ran away, and so Sisera ends up running to the tent of a woman named Yael. Yael, a woman who was aligned with the Israelites, sees this general coming. He's wounded. He asks to come inside her tent, and she lets him. He begs her, please don't tell anybody I'm here. Stand in the doorway. If anyone comes to see me, say I'm not here. Protect me, please. And Yael, supporting the Israelites, decided to formulate a plan. When Sisera asked for some water, she brought him some warm milk and put a blanket on top of him. And sure enough, he fell asleep. And as he was asleep, Yael goes over to the corner of her tent, picks up a tent peg, think about a very large nail, and drives that nail through his temple and kills the foreign general. Thus, her actions essentially saved the Israelite people. And it is at the hands of a woman, not to say in a negative way, but these stories prove that women can be just as brave and badass as anybody else. But Yael is not the only badass woman that we talk about in the Bible. If we go a little bit later in Jewish history, more towards the current time, there was another lesser known person named Judith during the time of the Assyrian Empire. So Judith, a beautiful widow, was so angry with other Israelites for not trusting that God will deliver them from the Assyrian Empire, who was attacking them and trying to take over their land. She takes it upon herself, talk about bravery, to go to the Assyrian general Holofernes and essentially went in as a spy. She told Holofernes that she'd be a spy against the people of Israel. She gained his trust, so much of his trust that he actually let her go into his tent. And one night, while he was sleeping, had a little bit too much to drink, and as he slept, she went over to him like the badass Israeli woman that she is, and she cut his head off. She single-handedly destroyed the entire Assyrian army, because once their general was gone, the entire army retreated and left, and Israel was not destroyed because of the action of a woman who was brave and took on an entire army. She wanted to show the Israelite people what it meant to believe in God and to put your money where your mouth is. Now, I'm not expecting you to take any of these stories at face value. I am an academic. I've studied the Torah. I've studied the Bible. And I know that some people hold the view that these are written stories by man and not necessarily by God. That's fair. Either way, what we can take from these stories, the fact that they were written at all by whoever wrote them, was hoping to prove the fact that these badass women take on a very important role in the early Israelite history. The women of this time period were singled out by these authors to show they were not just characters in the background. They were actively participating in the creation and the success of the Israelite nation. And after hearing some of these stories, you can understand where the DNA of Israelite women comes from. The Israelis today have this in them. And you're going to now hear some stories from the people who are coming out of Gaza and some of the things that they had done. And hopefully it'll make sense to you now why and how they did what they did. Because they come from this line of incredibly badass women that will stop at nothing to protect themselves, the ones they love, and their country. Some of you may remember the hostage that was released a long time ago in the first round of hostages, named Amit. Amit was released and talked a little bit publicly about the way that she was treated in captivity by her captors. But one thing she never mentioned until recently is how she owes her safety and her well-being to one of the other women in captivity. And that was one of the women who were released recently, Liri Albag. The story goes, according to Amit, that while she was possibly about to be sexually assaulted, Liri got up in the face of a hostage captor, probably someone from Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and literally defended her. Said to her captors, under no circumstances are you allowed to do this stuff to her, and risked her own life. Can you imagine this 19-year-old Israeli girl in captivity herself, probably weak, malnourished, going up to her captor, a terrorist, and demanding that he not touch or harm or sexually assault another person, risking her own life? The thought process behind that is unbelievable. Can you imagine the fearlessness? And that wasn't even the end of it. Liri, being the incredibly brilliant woman that she is, convinced Hamas to create the video that they released. If you remember, not that long ago, we saw Liri in that terrible video where they made her say really stupid things. They had a dog collar on her. She looked terrible. That was her idea. It turns out she convinced Hamas to make that video because she knew that she wanted her parents to know she was alive. So she actively convinced them, manipulated them, whatever you want to call it, to create a hostage video so that her parents would know that she is alive. And in one incredible act of defiance, Liri Albag apparently told the Hamas captors that she refused to go into the tunnels. And honestly, in nothing short of a miracle, in a way, they didn't mess with her. They actually didn't put her in a tunnel because specifically she said, I will not go. And for whatever reason, the aura around her, the fear they had of her, I don't know what it is. But she says she never got taken into a tunnel because of the way that she refused to go, and they didn't force her to go. I can't even imagine the chutzpah. For those of you who don't understand Yiddish, the guts, the chutzpah, the guts of a person to literally look a Hamas person in the face and say, I will not go. In all honesty, when I hear this story, I think of Deborah. Deborah, the judge who controlled an entire people with her voice, with her words. And yet Liri Albag can control anybody with her words. And people did not mess with her, like Deborah herself. The stories are endless. We still haven't even scratched the surface of all of the stories coming out from the terrible conditions that Hamas put these poor girls in. But there's one that I want to finish on, and this one is so powerful. Some of you might remember from Thursday last week, the released hostage Agam Berger. Agam was your typical Israeli girl. She wasn't very religious. She lived culturally Jewish in Israel, but didn't practice traditional Judaism per se. But when she got taken into Gaza, for some reason, she had this desire or need to become more observant, to connect with God. And so stories are coming out of the fact that she did a whole bunch of things that she never would have done before being taken captive. Somehow she found or asked for a Hebrew prayer book to actually start doing prayers. And she started actually following the Shabbat rules of not working on Shabbat. This is not something she would have done in the past, but in captivity, being forced, as we found out, to cook and clean and do all of these things for families in Gaza, essentially as a slave, and she refused to do it on Saturday. Again, imagine telling someone who could kill you at any moment, no, I'm refusing to cook and clean today because it's Shabbat, and I am not working on Shabbat. In addition, apparently, she chose to turn down food when it wasn't kosher. They were offering her meat to eat that wasn't kosher, and she refused to eat it. She would rather starve or be hungry than eat unkosher food. Again, before going into captivity, I don't know if she necessarily kept kosher. But in captivity, she makes her life so much harder to follow all of these rules. It's kind of mind-boggling. Meanwhile, completely separate from Agam, who's currently in captivity, Agam's mother goes to local rabbis in Israel to try and get some information, some help. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm struggling here. My daughter's in captivity. What do I do? And apparently, she, completely separate from Agam, decided to start following traditional Judaism. And she started, believe it or not, keeping Shabbat as one of the things that she was going to do. And what was so amazing and tragic is that it turns out, if you remember, Agam was supposed to be let go and released from Gaza on a Saturday. As you know, all of the hostage releases seem to be on Saturdays for whatever reason. And Agam was set to come back last week on Saturday. Apparently, when Agam's mother found out that she was set to be released on Saturday, she said to the IDF, believe it or not, I'm sorry. I am not going to go and meet my daughter on a Shabbat. I keep Shabbat now. I can't go. I can't get in a car. I can't drive down there. I don't know if this is because she made a deal with God and said, I will practice Judaism and keep my faith in order to get my daughter back, and didn't want to give up on that the minute her daughter was going to get out. So maybe she felt the need to keep Shabbat, even at the expense of missing her daughter being released from Gaza. But the story is that she apparently told the IDF, please explain to my daughter why I'm not here. I'm keeping Shabbat, and I will be there the minute I can when Shabbat is over. Imagine that absolute struggle from a mother to say that or to feel that. But meanwhile, at the same time that the mother is saying that she can't go on a Shabbat and she's so sorry, something happened. And if you remember, Agam was supposed to be let out on a Saturday, but for some reason, last minute, she was switched for another person. And then guess what happened? For some reason, when the Israelis went to talk to the mediators and Hamas and everyone decided that they were going to release Agam the next time. But rather than doing what would make sense, which is release them on Saturday with all of the other people that were going to come out on Saturday, for some crazy reason, they decided to do it on a Thursday. For the record, I don't think this was planned by the Israelis. I don't think they did this because of the mother's refusal to go on a Shabbat. This was completely an accident, coincidence, act of God, whatever you want to call it, that for some reason, the only time someone's been let go on a Thursday is the one whose mom can't come on a Saturday. And sure enough, when she was released on the Thursday, the mother was there waiting, and she got to see her mother the minute she got out of Gaza. This story gives me goosebumps. If it's an act of God, coincidence, I don't know. But both the daughter and the mother turn to God, both start keeping Shabbat, and somehow these little miracles are happening around us to allow the mother to go on the Thursday instead of the Saturday. I can't really explain it. When I hear this story, all I think about is Judith and how she put her faith in God, and it worked out. But in one last incredible act of divine power, I don't know what we'll call it, I'm going to share something with you that my rabbi had said this past weekend, because I can't claim credit for this incredible find. Agam was not really meant to come out from Gaza on Thursday, but for some reason, she came out on Thursday. And also on Thursday was a Jewish holiday of Rosh Chodesh, which means a new month. And on the new month, the first day of the new month, a special prayer is said every month. And in this prayer, which took place on Thursday, a prayer called Hallel, shows up the word Agam. Now, the name of a hostage showing up in a prayer on the day that that person came out of captivity, maybe it's a coincidence. So my rabbi, supposedly, went and looked through all of the prayer books, did a quick Google search. Agam does not show up in any other prayers in that form. That word shows up in other ways with prefixes and suffixes, never the word Agam. But on the day that she is released, the entire Jewish world recited a prayer with her name in it, and she was free. In the end, I've said on this podcast before that I struggle sometimes with the belief in coincidences. Is everything planned by God? It's hard to say when some of these things are happening that we are not actually witnessing little miracles, a little spark of the divine showing us that things are being taken care of. I know sometimes it's hard to believe, but definitely one thing I can tell you from the research on this podcast episode is the fact that Israeli women are the most badass women you will ever meet. And this goes back to their DNA. You could see how from Deborah through Yael and Queen Esther and Judith, there are so many women from the Israelite nation that have stood up and have protected the people around them and helped create the state and the people of Israel. I can go on for hours about women and female characters from the history books and women today fighting on the front lines of the IDF. And the women of today and the women of the past are nothing short of badass. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.